Story 1. The Parmesan Pipeline. In the northern Italian region of Emilia-Romagna, where the soft hills ripple with golden wheat and green vineyards, the air holds something else: the sharp, unmistakable scent of aging cheese. But behind that pleasant aroma, between the walls of ancient storage caves and temperature-controlled vaults, something far less savory began to fester. By the year 2008, a shadow economy had formed under the rind of tradition. This was no petty smuggling ring. This was the Parmesan Pipeline, a highly organized, cross-border network trafficking in Parmigiano Reggiano, known worldwide as the King of Cheese. The beginning of the rind. To understand this crime, you must understand the cheese. Real Parmigiano Reggiano is not merely a dairy product. It is a protected designation of origin, PDO item legally bound to specific ingredients, aging periods, and methods, all certified by the Italian consortium. Each wheel carries a unique serial number, stamp, and dotted inscription around its rind. Counterfeit versions exist globally, but the real fraud was happening not outside of Italy but within. A small-town logistics operator named Sergio Del Vecchio in Parma began noticing inconsistencies in shipping manifests. Deliveries were marked as degraded or destroyed in transit at far higher rates than typical. Del Vecchio, a former financial auditor turned freight manager, started tracking anomalies. His first find: 4 entire pallets of cheese marked as spoiled, all signed off by the same warehouse manager in Reggio Emilia. The problem: those same wheels were turning up across the border in Austria, repackaged under a private label that claimed the same PDO status. Del Vecchio brought his findings to the Consorzio del Formaggio Parmigiano Reggiano, who passed them to local police. But instead of launching a full investigation, the file was quietly shelved. It was, after all, just cheese. Just cheese until it was. In 2010, an arson attack struck a cold storage facility in Modena. Over 7,000 wheels of Parmigiano Reggiano were destroyed, costing an estimated €6 million in damages. At first glance, it was assumed to be a tragic accident until a forensic analysis discovered accelerants poured directly under the storage racks. Why would someone burn cheese? The answer emerged from the insurance records. The destroyed inventory had been drastically overvalued. The company had taken out a policy only months earlier at nearly double the standard market rate. Authorities realized this wasn't isolated, this was coordinated. Cheese wasn't being destroyed, it was being diverted. The real wheels were being replaced with lookalikes. Insurance would pay for loss, and the original product, shipped quietly through a circuit of intermediaries in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Germany, before being sold back into Italy or exported to gourmet markets in the US and Japan. The ringleader. Behind it all was a man whose name wouldn't become known until years later: Luca Paternostra, a mild-mannered agricultural consultant whose face rarely appeared in public, but whose fingerprints were on nearly every false certification the investigators found. Paternostra had once worked in the Consorzio's internal compliance team, but left under unclear circumstances in 2002. He knew the system from the inside: the stamping procedure, the codes, the inspections that could be bypassed with the right signature or a timely gift of cash or, as some investigators found out, luxury vacations. His base of operations was a seemingly innocuous warehouse in Lazara, which stored not cheese but labels, wrappers, and packaging. A forensic audit later uncovered dozens of counterstamps, many with outdated or duplicated numbers. This wasn't just cheese laundering. It was identity theft for cheese. The global black market for taste. By 2012, seizures of counterfeit Parmigiano Reggiano had risen dramatically in the US and Canada. Customs officials began to notice shipments arriving from unexpected origins: Argentina, Ukraine, even China, bearing Italian symbols. some even sporting fake PDO stamps. Interpol flagged shipments from a German distributor known as La Tavola d'Oro GmbH. After a sting operation uncovered mislabeled crates from Slovakia routed through Croatia, a wider operation was launched under Europol, codenamed Operation Gratuja, meaning greater. What they discovered stunned investigators. Over 89 million euros in falsely labeled cheese sales over 5 years. The laundering operation moved through at least 14 companies, many of them shell fronts registered to deceased individuals. One company, based in Liechtenstein, had no actual employees, just a postbox and a web presence. Another warehouse in southern France, near Aix-en-Provence, was found to store not only cheese but vacuum-sealed packages of expired meats, relabeled with new sell-by dates. Financial institutions and fragrant kickbacks. The depth of the corruption became evident when a regional bank in Milan was raided, and investigators found internal memos detailing pre-approved agricultural investments tied to fraudulent cheese producers. The bank had provided low-interest loans against the value of cheese inventories, many of which didn't exist. One case file detailed a single cheese aging facility, Caseificio del Stel, which had 3,000 wheels on paper but only 1,200 in storage. The missing wheels, never accounted for. The rest, authorities surmised, had likely been used as collateral in loan fraud schemes, meaning the crime was not merely black market distribution, but full-scale financial crime, disguised beneath the guise of regional food culture. Meanwhile, back in Parma, Sergio Del Vecchio, the whistleblower who had first noticed the strange shipping patterns, found his own home vandalized. Graffiti sprayed on his walls read, Chi Parla, Muore, he who speaks dies. He went into voluntary witness protection, while legal proceedings quietly escalated. But his contribution wouldn't go unnoticed. Years later, when a national broadcast aired a documentary on the cheese fraud rings, his anonymized testimony became a crucial turning point in public understanding of the case. By 2014, over 70 individuals had been charged in Italy alone, with international warrants issued across Austria, Germany, and the Czech Republic. But Luca Paternostre, the man at the center, remained missing. Interpol believed he was hiding somewhere in South America, possibly Brazil, operating under an assumed identity. He had vanished just like the cheese. But if Luca Paternostre could vanish so completely, was he ever really acting alone? And what became of the millions in phantom cheese? In 2015, a customs raid in Sao Paulo, Brazil, uncovered an unregistered warehouse filled with gourmet food products. Tucked between crates of high-end olive oil and smoked salmon were several dozen wheels of Parmigiano Reggiano Real, expertly aged and unmistakably Italian. But these wheels bore defunct certification numbers, all tied back to a discontinued Italian dairy cooperative that had gone bankrupt in 2009. To most, it looked like an odd case of mislabeled imports. To Italian investigators watching from across the Atlantic, it was a breadcrumb trail, and it pointed toward one man. The shadow of Paternostre. Interpol had been quietly tracking Luca Paternostre since 2013. Their intelligence placed him in Argentina for several months, followed by stints in Chile and later Paraguay. He didn't leave digital footprints, no social media, no personal accounts, no credit card use. But investigators noticed a pattern. In each region, luxury food import companies began to sprout, seemingly overnight. One such company, Delicacy Ltda, had its export certifications revoked after inconsistencies were found in its paperwork. The local office shut down within a month of questioning. Witnesses described its founder as a quiet Italian man with impeccable manners, who went by the name Alessandro Vital. Interpol believed that Vital was Paternostre, using fake documentation and a network of sympathetic expatriates to rebuild his empire this time, away from the scrutiny of European regulators. But even as they chased shadows abroad, investigators in Italy were facing a different dilemma. How deeply had the cheese fraud corrupted local institutions? Rotten at the core. In the city of Bologna, a mid-level inspector with Italy's Ministry of Agriculture was arrested after leaked documents suggested he had accepted over €400,000 in consulting fees from dairy companies connected to the pipeline. His name was Rodolfo Bianchi, and he was responsible for randomizing spot checks on Parmigiano Reggiano facilities. For at least 6 years, Bianchi had tipped off warehouses in advance, allowing them to swap counterfeit wheels with legitimate ones just in time for inspections. More disturbing was the reach of Paternostra's network into legal circles. Court documents revealed that a defense attorney representing multiple arrested warehouse owners had once worked under Paternostra at the Consorzio. Internal memos showed references to LP approvals, shorthand for Paternostra's sign-off during his years inside the compliance division. It became clear this wasn't just about cheese fraud. This was about institutional decay masked behind PDO stamps and traditions. The economics of dairy crime. For most of the world, cheese is a staple. For regions like Emilia-Romagna, it is a currency. One wheel of Parmigiano Reggiano can retail between €700 to €900, depending on age and certification. Multiply that by thousands of wheels stored in facilities, and you're looking at a commodity as powerful as gold or, perhaps more fittingly, aged bonds. Banks offered loans against cheese inventories. Facilities insured their stock. Futures markets, in a sense, existed among gourmet retailers. And all of it was built on the assumption that a cheese was what it claimed to be. Paternostra had found a flaw in that assumption and exploited it. He created ghost inventories, moved real wheels into underground markets, and printed fake certifications with the same quiet efficiency as a money launderer. And perhaps most ingeniously, he trafficked authenticity itself, selling the illusion of heritage to high-end clients who never thought to question the rind. The hidden caves of Lazzara. In the summer of 2016, acting on a tip, investigators uncovered a decommissioned Cold War-era bunker outside the town of Lazzara, a few kilometers from the warehouse where the original label forgery operation had been run. Deep within its stone corridors, they found a series of climate-controlled rooms lined wall-to-wall with aging wheels of cheese. Each one bore inconsistent markings, some with faint stamps from non-existent farms, others with batch numbers already flagged in prior seizures. Investigators called it the cheese crypt. Samples were taken for testing. Many were indeed legitimate Parmigiano Reggiano, some aged over 36 months. The conclusion: these wheels were stolen before ever reaching market and had been aging in hiding for years. Among the items recovered were detailed ledgers written in code, using dairy lingo that took weeks to decode. The ledgers described routes, handlers, customer names, and payment schedules. Cross-referencing the names revealed connections not only across Italy and Eastern Europe, but also to Brooklyn, New York. The American connection. In early 2017, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security conducted a raid on a Brooklyn-based import firm called Artigiano Imports, a small storefront specializing in rare and regional Italian cheeses. The raid, conducted under the joint initiative with Interpol, revealed over 500 wheels of undocumented Parmigiano Reggiano, most of which had expired or lacked traceable origin. Owner Dominic Ladarello, a second-generation cheesemonger, denied knowledge of any wrongdoing, but records showed that wire transfers from Ladarello's company had gone to shell firms in Slovenia, then rerouted through crypto wallets, some of which led back to Brazil. Ladarello's arrest created a domino effect. Other boutique importers across North America began destroying suspect stock or quietly pulling product from shelves. Some claimed ignorance, others simply closed shop. Among the documents seized in Brooklyn was an encrypted hard drive. After months of decryption work, Europol confirmed it contained one of the most comprehensive maps of the Parmesan black market ever compiled, including supplier codes, delivery routes, bribery estimates, and most stunningly, a client list that included chefs, restaurateurs, and distributors across 4 continents. Paternostre, it seemed, had built an empire of gourmet deception. The most wanted cheese man. Despite the growing web of arrests and seizures, Luca Paternostre remained invisible, at least officially. In mid-2018, a phone call intercepted by Brazilian authorities revealed a man calling himself LP, discussing shipment schedules with an unnamed distributor. The voice matched previous recordings of Paternostre from court archives. But by the time the Brazilian police arrived at the listed location, a boutique cheese shop in Belo Horizonte, the man was gone. So was the inventory. An Interpol red notice was reissued with an updated composite sketch. Rumors placed Paternostre in Uruguay, then later in Marrakesh, but nothing stuck. And still the wheels kept turning. Even as regulatory controls increased, small seizures continued. Wheels with mismatched stamps in Sydney, fake labels in Toronto, forged documentation in Dubai. The Parmesan pipeline, though wounded, was far from dismantled. Authorities had plugged holes in the system, but they couldn't plug the market's hunger for authenticity and the lengths people would go to feed it. A crime of culture. By 2019, Italy had begun reforming its cheese certification processes. QR codes replaced manual stamps. Independent third-party inspections became mandatory. Aging facilities were required to report inventories quarterly, but critics argued it was all too late. Paternostre was not just a smuggler, said criminologist Dr. Ilaria Fornaci, speaking at a 2020 Food Integrity Summit. He was a student of culture. He knew that heritage is currency. He sold belief, not just cheese. The quiet towns of Emilia-Romagna began to recover. Insurance payouts stabilized. Most of the involved banks wrote off their losses under agricultural disruption. But whispers remained. Wheels of Parmigiano Reggiano, especially older, high-quality ones, were now viewed with quiet suspicion. Buyers asked more questions. Some importers refused to stock certain labels unless authenticated by independent labs. And yet, no one could find Luca Paternostre. How does one man vanish so completely while his fingerprints remain on every rind? What secrets were never uncovered in the cheese crypt, and who else profited from the pipeline? For a long time, it was assumed that Luca Paternostre had fled to a remote corner of South America and lived out his days in quiet luxury. But in late 2021, an anonymous tip from an informant in Uruguay changed the course of the investigation. The tip included an address, a name Alonso Brighetti, and a photograph of a man standing behind the counter of a small wine and cheese bodega in the coastal town of Piriápolis. He wore a white apron, his hair graying at the temples, his posture modest, but his eyes narrow, calculating, matched every psychological profile compiled since 2009. Interpol agents were deployed in coordination with local authorities. But once again, Paternostre had vanished just before the raid. This time, however, he left something behind. The ledger that shouldn't exist. Inside a false bottom drawer beneath the shop's old register, agents discovered a single cloth-bound ledger. Not a digital file, not an encrypted drive, a handwritten journal. Inside were entries detailing shipments, bribes, and transactions spanning from 2010 to as recently as August 2021. This discovery confirmed what investigators feared. The Parmesan pipeline was not just a past tense operation, it was still very much alive. The ledger outlined several high-profile clients, including boutique restaurants in Dubai, Sao Paulo, and Tokyo. Each entry was annotated with tasting notes, fake certificate batch numbers, and courier contact names. The final entries were the most revealing. They included phone numbers and bank routing instructions, one of which led to a crypto account registered to a small address in Switzerland. When Swiss officials followed up, the trail led to a rental chalet registered to a shell company called La Fromage Noir AG. Surveillance footage showed a man matching Paternoster's description, leaving the property 3 days before agents arrived. In every instance, Paternoster remained one step ahead. The trial without a man. In early 2022, Italian prosecutors moved forward with a mass trial, one of the largest organized food fraud cases in European legal history. 93 individuals were charged with crimes ranging from fraud and racketeering to money laundering and bribery. The case was held in Bologna, and among the accused were cheese inspectors, customs officials, packaging facility owners, bank loan officers, and even a local politician who had invested in multiple dairy firms tied to the pipeline. The trial lasted over 9 months. Whistleblower Sergio Del Vecchio, now living under a new identity in northern Italy, provided testimony via video, recounting the early anomalies that brought the fraud to light. His voice trembled not with fear, but fatigue. Years of watching from the sidelines, unsure whether the beast he'd uncovered would ever be caged. Key testimonies revealed. Warehouse owners were paid to report spoilage of perfectly good cheese. Export companies manipulated shipping routes, sometimes sending cheese through 3 or more countries to obscure its origin. Bank officers falsified collateral evaluations, knowing full well the inventories were inflated. In one case, a warehouse fire believed to be an accident was actually orchestrated by Paternoster as a cover to explain a missing batch that had already been smuggled to Eastern Europe. Of the 93 accused, 67 were convicted. Many received suspended sentences, some were heavily fined, and a handful went to prison. But not a single person claimed to have seen or spoken to Paternoster in years. Some suggested he had died. Others believed he had plastic surgery and now lived quietly in Morocco or Southeast Asia. One theory posited that he was operating under yet another alias, somewhere in the luxury dairy trade, perhaps even back in Italy, hiding in plain sight. Ripples beyond the rind. The fallout extended far beyond the cheese world. Italy's Ministry of Agricultural Policy launched sweeping reforms, requiring GPS-tracked inventory systems for PDO-protected goods. Banks faced tighter scrutiny over commodity-backed loans. The Parmigiano Reggiano Consortium launched a global marketing campaign to restore trust in the brand, emphasizing transparency, blockchain-tracked sourcing, and 3D scanned rind authentication. In the U.S., the FDA increased inspections on imported cheeses, and retail chains began demanding traceable digital histories for all high-end food imports. Even in distant markets like Japan and the UAE, buyers began to second-guess their suppliers, asking for micro-certificate validations and age tracking reports. Luxury cheese had become a suspicious purchase. And yet quietly, demand never waned. If anything, the story of the Parmesan pipeline only enhanced the allure. Some collectors began seeking out questionable vintage wheels as underground collectors' items, willing to pay premium prices for smuggled goods they knew were illegal. One journalist called it the Banksy effect of dairy. The legacy of Luca Paternoster. Luca Paternoster was never caught. No death certificate has ever been filed. No proof of life since 2021 has emerged, but his influence lingers like the scent of strong cheese in an old cellar, inescapable, pungent, and strangely complex. To this day, no one is quite sure how many millions he earned, or how many false certificates are still floating in circulation. It's possible that some of the cheese on your grocery store shelf, right now, carries the ghost of his handiwork. Whistleblower Sergio Del Vecchio was once asked by a reporter if he ever regretted coming forward. He paused, then answered. Cheese was never just food to us. It was tradition. It was trust. Luca stole that. He made us question our own taste. That's the worst kind of crime, the kind that changes the way you look at something forever. So, in a world where food has become identity and authenticity is a product, how much are we really tasting and how much are we believing? And if the Parmesan pipeline could happen so quietly, what other industries are aging crimes just beneath the surface? Story 2. The Buttermilk Laundress of Wisconsin. In the quiet town of Oconto Falls, Wisconsin, the streets roll in gentle waves, echoing the surrounding farmland. Barns speckle the horizon, and the scent of fresh hay and churned cream lingers on the wind. To most, it's just another slice of Midwestern Americana. But between the 1930s and early 1950s, Oconto Falls harbored a secret one cloaked in the folds of fresh laundry, butter-soaked paper, and silence. At the center of it all was a woman known only as Mrs. Edna Mee Klugman, the town laundress. She was unassuming, short, wore her hair tightly pinned, always in a pressed apron, usually dotted with cream stains. She spoke softly, walked slowly, and by all appearances was a devout, widowed homemaker. But Edna Mee wasn't just washing clothes and pressing uniforms. She was running one of the strangest laundering operations in Wisconsin's agricultural history, not laundering money, but butter, and by extension, fraudulent dairy subsidies and wartime ration coupons. And for nearly 2 decades, no one noticed. The Dairy Depression and the rise of rural ingenuity. To understand the conditions that allowed this quiet crime to flourish, we must go back to 1931, during the tail end of the Great Depression. Wisconsin's dairy industry, once a thriving hub of small family farms and creameries, was in a state of collapse. Milk prices had bottomed out. The federal government introduced various subsidy programs to support dairy producers, particularly those who could prove they produced grade A butterfat. These subsidies weren't enormous, but they were reliable. A few extra dollars per week could mean survival for a farm family. The only catch: the producers had to keep records, precise measurements of fat content, volume, and production dates. At the time, very few people in rural towns had formal bookkeeping experience. Enter Edna Mee. Though her official job was managing a small, private laundry service, she had previously worked as a clerk for a milk bottling plant in Appleton. She knew how the paperwork worked. She knew the codes, the forms, the fat content verification sheets. And she knew how to forge them. By 1935, she had quietly offered her accounting services to at least 3 nearby farms, all of whom saw noticeable boosts in their subsidy payments after working with her. There were no red flags, just better margins. That's how it started. Buttermilk trails and butter paper. Over the years, Edna Mee built a strange network. It began innocently. She would take leftover buttermilk from local farms, a byproduct typically discarded or fed to livestock, and reprocess it using home churning methods, blending in cream and salt until it resembled fresh butter. She then wrapped it in reused butter paper packaging from local creameries. Neighbors assumed she was simply thrifty waste, not want not. But her wrappers weren't just used for home consumption. Through a quiet agreement with a grocer in Green Bay, Edna Mee began selling small parcels of her leftover butter under the label of a now-defunct creamery whose packaging she had saved in a chest in her laundry room. She charged slightly less than market rate, and her limited supply created a kind of rural mystique. People believed it was just a clever reuse of surplus. No one thought to ask how a laundress had a steady stream of 92 score butter. The war years, rationing and opportunity. During World War II, things took a curious turn. Butter became a highly rationed commodity. The federal government issued ration coupons to control how much individuals and businesses could purchase. Black markets sprouted in every major city, but in Oconto Falls, it took a different shape. Edna Mee, ever watchful, began collecting unused ration coupons from elderly widows and bachelor farmers offering laundry credits in exchange. With enough coupons, she could legally purchase butter, then sell it again at black market prices to grocers outside town limits. She never sold directly. Instead, she used milk delivery routes as her pipeline. Her driver, a teenager named Francis Frankie Lubin, later testified in court that he was told to just drop the parcels and never ask what was in them. At one point, Edna Mee's operation spanned over 4 counties. She was now forging butter origin certificates, butterfat content reports, farm subsidy requests, ration coupon usage logs, and even veterinary reports to cover up sick cows that never produced. In the words of one federal auditor, years later, she created a dairy shadow economy with a pen, an apron, and perfect handwriting. Cracks in the cream. By 1949, however, inconsistencies began to surface. A USDA compliance officer noticed that 2 different farms in Oconto Falls had submitted identical fat content values for 3 consecutive months. A deeper dive showed that several entries from these farms bore the same handwriting, even though the documents were supposed to be completed by different farmers. The officer flagged the anomalies but didn't pursue them. After all, these were small-town subsidies, not million-dollar deals. But the paperwork ended up on the desk of Agent Walter Kessler, a junior investigator at the time with an eye for statistical anomalies. Kessler quietly launched an unofficial investigation. Over the next 14 months, he would uncover 36 subsidy forms with identical handwriting, ration coupon serial numbers used more than once, butter shipment logs without matching creamery dispatch records, and a trail of matching recipient names who never actually existed. One name came up repeatedly as a notary and record keeper, Edna Mee Klugman. Still, there wasn't enough to arrest her. So Kessler devised a plan. Operation Salted Apron. In 1951, Kessler posed as a government representative interested in auditing dairy records for possible tax relief incentives. He approached Edna Mee directly under this guise. She welcomed him with a warm smile, offered him buttermilk cookies, and invited him into her spotless kitchen. The walls were lined with shelves of carefully labeled ledgers, each one dated, each one perfectly written. Too perfect. Kessler noticed small inconsistencies entries where yields exceeded possible values for the number of livestock reported. On one sheet, he noted a sudden spike in butterfat yield during winter months when cows typically produce less, not more. He didn't confront her. Instead, he asked to borrow the ledgers to verify details back at his office. She smiled again. "Of course, dear, but do be gentle. Some of those books are older than you." He took them, carefully photocopied them, and returned them within 24 hours. Edna Mee never suspected a thing. What Kessler didn't know yet was that he was holding the master record of her entire operation. But if Edna Mee's ledgers contained evidence of a 2-decade fraud, why did it take 2 more years before she was charged? And what secrets did those books reveal about the town's quiet complicity? By the time Agent Walter Kessler returned the ledgers to Edna Mee Klugman's tidy home in Oconto Falls, he had amassed more than 100 pages of photocopied evidence. His initial impressions were confirmed. Someone likely Edna Mee was falsifying records tied to federal dairy subsidies and wartime rationing. But the story was deeper than one laundress cooking the books. Because the more Kessler looked, the more he saw signs of quiet community participation, or at the very least, willful ignorance. The wall of silence. Akanto Falls was small enough that everyone knew each other, but big enough to avoid suspicion if everyone just looked the other way. Kessler interviewed 4 farm owners who had submitted questionable forms. All claimed Edna Mee had simply helped them organize the paperwork. They insisted she had no involvement in their actual numbers. Yet every ledger showed her neat script. Even when Kessler brought in a USDA graphologist to confirm handwriting matches, farmers held fast. "That ain't her writing, she just fills in the blanks. That's what she's always done," one man said. "She's a help, not a criminal." No one in town would say otherwise, not the grocer, not the mail carrier who delivered parcels across counties, not the schoolteacher whose children wore uniforms ironed by Edna Mee herself. And not Frankie Lubin, the milk route driver who had now moved to Milwaukee and was working as a mechanic. When approached, Frankie offered little. "She paid fair, that's all I can say." It wasn't loyalty, necessarily. It was survival math. During the Depression and later during the war, people like Edna Mee made things work when the system failed. And when she skimmed a bit off the top, everyone ate better. The Klugman File. Back in Madison, Kessler assembled what came to be known internally as the Klugman File. It contained evidence of forged USDA form templates, manually traced over carbon copies, ration coupons redeemed after expiration, many reused or copied from original books, a detailed chart mapping falsified subsidy applications connected to 22 different farms, and multiple ledgers showing butter production quantities inconsistent with known livestock counts. One entry read, January 4, 1946, 22 pounds, churned from Farm B 5 cows, fat test 4.3%, grade AEMK. The problem: the cows in question had been sold in 1944, according to state records. Kessler was building a case not just against a woman, but against an invisible machine hidden in plain sight. But federal prosecutors hesitated. The value of the fraud, even over 20 years, was only around $28,000 by their estimates, meager by modern standards, but substantial then. Still, they feared the optics of putting an elderly woman, a laundress with no prior record, on trial for something most would consider creative survival. It was a political calculation, one that didn't sit well with Kessler. A surprise turn. Everything changed in March 1953, when Kessler received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a single torn sheet from one of Edna Mee's ledgers, along with a note. "She's planning to burn them. You need to move now." The handwriting was shaky, and there was no signature. But the torn sheet was unmistakable. It listed a butter transaction dated only 2 weeks prior, involving a farm Kessler had never seen on Edna Mee's records before. It was proof that she was still active, still forging and still profiting. He returned to Akanto Falls the next day. Smoke on 5th Street. When he arrived, Edna Mee's house was already burning. A neighbor had reported a chimney fire that quickly spread to the roof. Firefighters managed to contain most of the damage to the attic and laundry room. Kessler arrived as smoke still curled from the scorched eaves. Inside the laundry room, now blackened, he found remnants of ledgers, still smoldering. Some were intact at the center, protected by a metal box. The charred edges curled like pages in a history book burning itself out. They were ledgers Kessler hadn't seen before. More recent, more incriminating. One listed butter parcel weights and ration coupon numbers matching entries on seized black market products recovered by the USDA in Green Bay. This was the direct link he'd needed. Another ledger listed names of courier drivers, cash payments made to market partners, and something labeled Grocer 14B/Milwaukee, $51.60. That grocer, later identified as a Polish deli, had unknowingly sold repackaged butter to state capitol restaurants. The web extended further than Kessler had imagined. The arrest. 2 days later, Edna Mee Klugman was arrested quietly in her home. She didn't resist. She didn't protest. She only asked if she could collect her linens before being taken into custody. The charges were complex: forgery of federal documents, defrauding federal agricultural programs, unauthorized use and resale of rationed goods, mail fraud. She was 61 years old at the time of her arrest. The community was shocked on the surface, but beneath the outrage, many people whispered that it had been only a matter of time. Some neighbors left food on her doorstep after she was taken away. Others wrote anonymous letters of support. One even offered to buy her house at fair market value and keep it in town. Her trial was set for October 1953 in federal court. The trial of the butter witch. Press coverage was mild at first, mostly local papers, with cheeky headlines like, "Laundress caught churning trouble in dairy town." But as the trial progressed, national interest grew. The story had all the ingredients of a Midwestern myth: a kindly laundress, forged butter, war-era coupons, and black market grocers. Journalists dubbed her the Butter Witch of Wisconsin. In court, Edna Mee remained calm. When asked if she had forged the documents, she said, "I filled in what needed to be filled. The farms were good. The cows were good. The books just needed to match." She didn't deny her role, only the idea that it was criminal. Her defense rested on 3 arguments. She never profited directly. The money went to farmers. No one was harmed, as all butter sold was safe and locally produced. The government's rationing and subsidy systems were flawed, and her actions filled a necessary gap. To everyone's surprise, the jury deliberated for less than a day. She was found guilty on 3 counts: falsifying federal documents, unlawful distribution of rationed goods, and defrauding the USDA. She was sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security facility and ordered to pay $2,500 in restitution, which she quietly paid within a year of her release. But when Edna Mee left prison in 1955, why did she find her house perfectly preserved and her ledgers missing? Who had protected her legacy? And how did her quiet influence linger long after she disappeared from public life? When Edna Mee Klugman returned to Oconto Falls in the early spring of 1955, she didn't return to a ruined life. Quite the opposite. Her modest 2-story home on 5th Street had been repaired. The scorched laundry room had fresh siding. The garden beds were replanted with early tulips and snap peas. Her mailbox bore a fresh coat of red paint. The community had not just forgiven her, they had waited for her. A small welcome basket sat on her front steps. A handwritten note tucked inside read, "The cows still need feeding. R." The missing ledgers. Though federal investigators believed many of Edna Mee's ledgers had been destroyed in the fire, the surviving books had been tagged and stored as evidence. Yet when her case file was declassified in the 1970s, 2 key ledgers, those containing names of participating grocers and out-of-county distributors, were nowhere to be found. The evidence storage logs from the USDA regional office in Madison noted, Item 22, Ledger March, June 1952, missing from vault shelf 4C, entry removed without sign-out. No record of who removed it, no chain of custody. Rumors swirled that someone in law enforcement or the dairy industry had taken it to prevent deeper fallout. Some speculated that a co-op executive was implicated. Others said names in the ledger included a state assemblyman, a frequent diner at one of the Milwaukee restaurants later linked to the black market butter sales. Whatever the truth, those ledgers were never recovered. A town's quiet arrangement. After her release, Edna Mee never returned to laundering clothes commercially, but her small porch became a place of consultation. Neighbors would visit with questions about taxes, subsidy forms, and even handwritten recipes. Some left with jars of clarified butter, others with jars of silence. Her old milk delivery teen, Frankie Lubin, now married with children, visited her twice a month. He brought her cream, eggs, and newspapers. Their conversations were always held on the porch, never inside. In the town's public records, Edna Mee re-emerged in 1957 as a co-signer on a microloan to a struggling dairy startup. It would go on to become one of the longest-standing cheese brands in northeast Wisconsin. No one ever formally accused her of resuming any black market activity, but then again, no one ever asked. The Kessler tapes. Agent Walter Kessler, who had since moved on to larger agricultural fraud cases, was interviewed decades later for a university research project on rural crime and resilience. When asked about Edna Mee, he replied, "She wasn't a crook, she was a survivalist in an apron. If you ask me, the system was a bigger criminal than she ever was." He revealed that he had always suspected she was protecting others, that her forgeries were designed not for greed but for stability. Each form she altered, each butter coupon she recycled, was an attempt to smooth the rough edges of a system that had never been made for the rural poor. When pressed on why the USDA never reopened the case after discovering the ledgers had gone missing, he simply said, "Because by then nobody wanted the truth. Not the town, not the farms, not even the government." The final curtain. Edna Mee Klugman passed away in 1976 at the age of 83. Her obituary was short, printed in the Oconto County Reporter. Edna M. Klugman, beloved neighbor and friend, passed peacefully in her home. Known for her kindness, her skill with linens, and her generosity during hard times. No surviving family, no funeral service by request. But weeks later, at the local town fair, a tribute booth appeared the laundress's table. It featured a display of antique butter churns, ration coupons, and a single black and white photo of Edna Mee folding laundry beside her wood stove. Beside the photo, a card simply read, "We fed each other, that was the crime." A lasting imprint. Though never publicly acknowledged, Edna Mee's legacy left structural changes in how rural agricultural subsidies were distributed. Better auditing procedures were implemented. Ration coupon reuse tracking became digitized in the 1970s. Federal subsidy forms now required independent verification by licensed inspectors, not self-reported handwritten logs. Some scholars have since used her case as a framework for understanding small-town resistance, how quiet crimes can be both wrong and necessary, depending on your vantage point. Her case, once seen as fraud, is now taught in criminology courses as a case study in moral gray zones, where laws clash with survival, and paperwork can be more powerful than pistols. A question that never left. One lingering theory remained. If Edna Mee was only the scribe, and others were the beneficiaries, then who was really running the operation? Did Edna Mee act alone out of duty and quiet rebellion? Or did she take the fall to protect a wider ring of conspirators, a town-sized secret kept safe behind freshly pressed shirts and a cooling slab of butter? Story 3. Stealing Silence, the Librarian of Lost Archives. In the heart of New Haven, Connecticut, where Yale University casts a long academic shadow over the city's aging bricks and cobblestone alleys, a much smaller institution once sat quietly along Elm Street, the Winthrop Town Library. It wasn't famous. It wasn't even particularly well-funded. The floors creaked. The walls smelled faintly of mildew and dust jackets, but it held something far more fragile than books. Trust. And in the late 1990s, that trust was shattered not with violence, not with theft in the traditional sense, but through a systematic erasure of public knowledge, orchestrated by the one person the town trusted most, the head librarian, Meredith Vale. The portrait of a librarian. Meredith Vale had all the markings of a quiet, bookish professional. She'd worn cardigans, horn-rimmed glasses, and her graying hair in a tight twist for decades, always on time, always polite, always reading. She began working at the Winthrop Town Library in 1974 and became head librarian in 1986. During her tenure, she was credited with restoring the building's historic wing, applying for literacy grants, and introducing interlibrary lending systems. Parents praised her reading circles. Local historians relied on her for town records. But behind that gentle demeanor and impeccable cataloging was a woman with an extraordinary sense of control and a secret history of carefully curated deception. The missing archives. In 1999, a graduate student named Theo Mendel from Yale's American Studies Department arrived at the Winthrop Library to study local industrial records from the 1930s. Specifically, he was tracing the history of a now-defunct textile mill, Greystone Weaving Co., which had once employed a large number of immigrant workers in dangerous conditions. The town's archives, according to official state records, were supposed to contain employment ledgers, safety violation reports, and court filings from the 1940s labor trials. But when Theo requested the materials, Meredith politely informed him they were currently under reclassification. He returned 2 weeks later, still unavailable. When he asked again, Meredith told him that several of the boxes had likely been water damaged during a pipe issue in '97. Theo didn't buy it. He filed a Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) request with the town clerk's office. The clerk, confused, responded that no records of such damage had ever been reported. And more strangely, none of the items Theo had requested were listed in the library's current catalog system at all. They had been deaccessioned. What does it mean to deaccess? In library science, deaccessioning refers to the formal removal of items from a collection typically due to damage, redundancy, or lack of relevance. It's not inherently suspicious. Most libraries do it regularly. But in 2001, a state audit of small library collections turned up an anomaly. The Winthrop Town Library had deaccessioned over 1,200 items between 1996 and 2000, an unusually high number for a local archive of its size. The removals included corporate tax records, local court case transcripts, land dispute filings, minutes from town council meetings, immigration employment registries, 2 copies of a controversial memoir written by a local labor organizer in the 1960s, all approved by one person, Meredith Vale. When asked to produce the deaccessioning forms, she handed over a neat stack of signed documents, each citing space limitations, mold damage, or archival redundancy. But the forms had a curious detail. Many of them were backdated and, in some cases, typed on a machine that hadn't been in use since the early 1980s. The conspiracy of quiet. By the fall of 2001, Theo's concerns had reached Yale's legal department. He was joined by Professor Judith Bramer, an expert in industrial labor history, who had previously accessed some of the now-missing documents back in 1989. She remembered clearly viewing Greystone employee logs and reading transcripts of a 1944 labor court case involving chemical burns and child labor violations. Now they were gone. Judith publicly questioned the library's oversight in a faculty publication. That article triggered a review by the Connecticut Library Consortium, who dispatched an archival specialist to investigate. Their findings were disturbing. Over the span of 5 years, Meredith Vale had removed thousands of pages of historical documentation from public access, claimed false damage or duplication reasons, personally ordered shredding of select materials without secondary authorization, blocked interlibrary loan requests for controversial local documents, and perhaps most telling, she had recatalogued remaining records to obscure what had once existed. Motive in the margins. What could possibly drive a librarian, especially one so respected, to such an act of long-term information sabotage? At first, some assumed Meredith had political motivations. Many of the records she erased documented unethical corporate behavior, racial discrimination, and local government failures. Was she protecting the town's image? Others theorized it was personal. Meredith's father, Calvin Vale, had been a supervisor at Greystone Weaving Co. during the same years many of the missing records were created. Was she scrubbing the past to shield her family name? Meredith refused interviews. She announced her retirement in late 2001, shortly before an official investigation was launched. She moved to a small cottage near Lake Warramog and avoided public events. But then something unexpected happened. A box appears. In March 2002, Theo Mendel received an anonymous package delivered to his Yale campus mailbox. Inside was a wooden index card file, sealed with tape and dated Winthrop, 1973. The cards inside contained catalog numbers for deaccessioned records, notes in Meredith's handwriting, reference codes for town archive boxes that were never officially logged. Some cards bore red ink notations. To shred, mold risk equals excuse, Lillian equals protect. The last one stood out. Lillian was Lillian Morante, a local Italian-American woman who had testified against Greystone executives in the 1944 labor trial. Her name had all but vanished from town history, no street name, no records, no obituary. Yet here she was, scribbled in red ink, preserved in secrecy. When the Yale faculty reviewed the cards, they realized what they had wasn't just a log, it was a confession of curation, a record of what Meredith Vale had removed, and perhaps why. But who sent the box and why now? And how much damage had already been done to the town's history, with so much already shredded, burned, or quietly refiled? When the box of index cards arrived anonymously at Yale, a quiet ripple spread through both academic and archival communities. In a world where documentation is history, the mere existence of a curated destruction list was both a scandal and a rare, tangible artifact of intentional historical erasure. The index cards weren't just an inventory of what was removed, they were a map, and the marginalia told a story few were prepared to face. The Lillian entry. One card in particular stood out. Box 97 3B LLM, Lillian Morante Trial Statements 1944. Note, highly sensitive. Consider family standing. Don't allow external request. Deaccess 1997. Excuse, insect damage. Lillian Morante, born 1913, had been a textile inspector at Greystone Weaving Co., and according to limited surviving newspaper clippings, was the only woman to testify against the company during the 1944 federal labor trial. No further mention of her existed in town records. No obituary, no cemetery listing, not even a census notation post 1950. Yale graduate student Theo Mendel and Professor Judith Bramer became obsessed with uncovering Lillian's story. They believed she represented the root motive for Meredith Vale's years-long archival manipulation. But all trails led to dead ends until they expanded their search beyond public libraries. A request to the Connecticut State Archives revealed a lone copy of an unprocessed oral history tape, donated anonymously in the 1980s. Its label: Winthrop, LM Unknown Woman, 1982. Judith and Theo listened together in a Yale recording studio. What they heard changed everything. The tape. The voice on the cassette was older, deliberate, and unpolished. They told us the dye wasn't toxic, that it was just part of the job. But our hands blistered, turned red, then black. Some of the boys lost fingers. I went to court. I told them the truth. After that, I wasn't hired nowhere again. The tape never mentioned her name directly, but based on the content and timeline, it became clear. This was Lillian Morante. Further investigation confirmed the voice matched a school interview recording of Lillian from 1940. She had been silenced, economically and historically. Her trial testimony, once part of public record, had been systematically erased from both town archives and collective memory. Only the index card and this cassette remained. Meredith's motive, protection or suppression. The emerging question was no longer what Meredith had done, but why? And that question only deepened when Theo stumbled upon a 1971 letter in the Yale Rare Manuscripts collection, hidden in a stack of local historical correspondence. The letter, dated June 18, 1971, was written by Calvin Vale, Meredith's father and former Greystone supervisor. It was addressed to the Winthrop Chamber of Commerce and contained a chilling paragraph. There are still rumblings about the 1944 trial. If this LM woman continues to stir trouble, there will need to be quiet corrections made to ensure the town's reputation and our investments remain protected. The signature was unmistakable. Meredith's father hadn't just known about Lillian, he had considered her a threat. Theo and Judith theorized that Meredith's erasures weren't random, nor were they driven by space or budget concerns. They were personal acts, perhaps protective of her family legacy, perhaps complicit in its ongoing harm. Either way, they were deliberate, and they violated nearly every ethical code in the archival profession. The investigative unraveling. With the index cards, the oral history tape, and the letter from Calvin Vale, Professor Bramer submitted a full report to the Connecticut Library Consortium and Yale's legal office. A formal complaint was filed. But Meredith Vale, now 69, and retired in Lake Warramog, refused all contact. The consortium's legal authority was limited. They could recommend professional censure, but with no criminal charges filed and no chain of custody for the index cards, they were stuck in bureaucratic limbo. What followed instead was a series of public reckonings. Yale hosted a symposium titled Silent Erasures, Censorship in Local Archives. An investigative article in the Hartford Courant exposed the story under the headline, "The Librarian Who Deleted a Town." And most importantly, Lillian Morante's name began to reappear on academic papers, on local history websites, even in a petition to name a town library room in her honor. The final archive. In the winter of 2003, another anonymous delivery arrived, this time to the Yale Historical Manuscripts office. Inside was a single banker's box. It contained a handwritten note. "You wanted the truth, here what I could save, M." Several carbon copies of Greystone employee ledgers, 1942-45. Fragments of court transcripts, all stamped duplicate copy, Town of Winthrop. 3 typed personal letters from Lillian to town council members, dated 1946-1948. A final index card, unfiled, with just one line. "Lillian Morante deserves better than a blank shelf." The box was signed only with a handwritten M. No return address, no fingerprints. Meredith Vale was never seen in public again. Quiet consequences. The Winthrop Town Library, under new leadership, launched a restoration archive initiative, partnering with state archives and private collectors to rebuild lost public records. The Yale team published a digital archive titled The Lost Collections of Winthrop, a case study in information control. It became required reading in several archival studies programs. Lillian Morante, was honored posthumously at the 2020 Connecticut Labor Rights Conference. Her name now appears on a scholarship for first-generation students pursuing history degrees at Yale. A final thought. History doesn't disappear with fire or flood. More often, it vanishes by quiet fingers and silent drawers, by reclassification slips and inkless stamps. But when the right people start asking the wrong questions, even the most deliberate erasures can leave just enough ghostly residue to be remembered. So in a world where information is preservation, who decides what we keep and what's allowed to vanish beneath the weight of silence and family loyalty? Story 4. The Tulip Scheme of Harlem, Michigan. Every spring, the town of Harlem, Michigan, blooms into color. Rows of tulips, reds, yellows, purples burst from carefully plotted beds along Main Street, curling toward the sky like paint strokes in a still life. Tourists come by the busload. Bakers prepare Dutch pastries. Families pose beside windmills, and the town dons its quaintest mask. But in the early 2000s, beneath this picturesque celebration of heritage, a scandal was taking root in the soil, one that would eventually be known as the Tulip Scheme. It wasn't about flowers, not really. It was about land, paper profits, shell companies, and a retired mailman named Dirk Van Os, whose slow voice and slower shuffle masked one of the most cleverly orchestrated land frauds in Michigan's recent history. The Bloomtown Boom. Harlem, Michigan, not to be confused with Holland, MI, is a small Dutch-settled town built around agriculture, faith, and modest living. Every spring, it hosts the Lakeshore Tulip Festival, a regional event that pulls in tens of thousands of visitors and millions in tourism revenue. In 2002, with the housing market roaring and land values rising along Michigan's western corridor, the Harlem City Council proposed a festival grounds expansion plan. The plan was simple. Buy up underutilized farmland surrounding the main tulip fields. Convert part of it into an expanded event space. Develop the rest into small retail zones and community gardens. The idea received overwhelming support. Federal grants were secured. Local banks pledged favorable loans to involved farmers. Everything looked above board. But within the first year of implementation, land prices had doubled. Several transactions appeared under obscure LLC names, and farmland that had long been fallow was now registered under companies that had never paid property tax before. And behind many of those LLCs stood one name, Dirk Van Os. A quiet man with a complicated ledger. Dirk had been the town's mailman for nearly 35 years. He retired in 1999. He was known for walking his route well into his 60s, never missing a birthday card or misplacing a bill. Most assumed he lived off a modest pension and the occasional inheritance from his late wife's side. So it surprised many when, in 2003, Dirk suddenly purchased 11 acres of land just outside town limits. When asked, he smiled and replied, "Just looking to grow something new in my old age." What few knew was that Dirk had also earned an online paralegal certification, spent his retirement studying real estate loopholes, and quietly had opened 4 separate LLCs in Michigan and Delaware. Each LLC had different names, vague missions, and shared mailing addresses, but they all traced back to a P.O. box inside the Harlem post office. The same post office Dirk had worked in for decades. The Tulip Development Co-op. At the center of the scheme was a newly formed group called the Tulip Development Co-op, TDC. It branded itself as a nonprofit initiative to help sustainably develop agri-tourism through Dutch heritage. In reality, the TDC was a shell. It filed no real activity with the state beyond a mission statement and a rotating board on paper. In truth, the board was Dirk, his cousin Pieter, and a woman listed as C. Wells, who investigators later found did not exist. The The TDC began buying land parcels from elderly farmers who didn't question the contracts, especially since Dirk, whom they all knew, presented the offers personally. Many of these properties were purchased at below-market rates, under the promise they'd be converted into community assets. But within months, those same plots were sold again, this time at highly inflated prices, to other shell companies Dirk controlled. On paper, the land had appreciated 400% in less than a year. That paper was enough to secure development loans, grants, and even tax credits for eco-forward initiatives. And not a single tulip had been planted yet. The accountant who noticed. It wasn't a journalist or a whistleblower who first caught the inconsistency. It was a part-time accountant at a local credit union named Maribel Sanchez. Maribel was reviewing a loan application filed by a newly formed LLC seeking $320,000 to prepare tulip-compatible soil for planting. The application listed assets that didn't make sense, multiple overlapping land parcels, duplicate tax IDs, and a signature that matched a different LLC's paperwork she'd reviewed the month before. She raised the issue to her supervisor. The supervisor told her to drop it. Dirk Van Os was well respected, and the land was already on the city's expansion map. But Maribel didn't drop it. Instead, she began printing out every loan application tied to tulip-related LLCs. Over the course of 4 weeks, she quietly assembled a spreadsheet of 6 LLCs, all incorporated within 18 months. 4 different parcel numbers attached to the same mailing address. Over $2.1 million in circulated loans, grants, and city subsidies. And 15 plots of land that were declared non-developable due to soil toxicity, but still sold as commercial ready. The deeper she dug, the more tangled the petals became. The paper flower folds. By late 2004, the Tulip Development Co-op had collected over $4.3 million in combined city, state, and federal funds. New construction signs had gone up, mock storefronts with faux Dutch architecture promising a tulip market, a wooden shoe museum, even a windmill bistro. But the land remained untouched. It was all theater signage and concept drawings stapled to empty fields. No building permits had been pulled, no utility lines extended, and no tulip bulbs ordered. When Maribel finally presented her findings to a local planning commissioner, he agreed to open a quiet inquiry. What he found stunned him. The entire expansion project was a facade, engineered not to grow tourism, but to inflate the value of worthless land and cash out public funds through private shell companies. And it all pointed back to Dirk. But if the town revered Dirk Van Os, how would they handle the news that their mailman-turned-developer had been quietly profiting off the festival meant to honor their shared heritage? And how deep did the deception really go? Were others helping to keep the scheme rooted in place? When the initial findings of Maribel Sanchez's spreadsheet made their way to the Harlem City Planning Commission, the instinct was to ignore, not investigate. Dirk Van Os wasn't just some developer. He was the mailman. The man who delivered retirement checks, handed out Halloween candy from his root bag, and helped clear snow from neighbors' driveways in the winter. He'd been in most of their homes, trusted, familiar, harmless. But as Commissioner Carl DeWitt studied the files, his stomach turned. There were just too many overlaps. The land parcel numbers, the grant requests with copied language, the construction contracts awarded to companies with no listed employees, just a mailbox at Dirk's old house. Reluctantly, DeWitt made the call. A formal inquiry would be opened under the pretense of routine grant reconciliation. That's when everything began to unravel. A town of shadows. As the inquiry widened, investigators discovered something strange. None of the Tulip Development Co-op's board members could be located. C. Wells, listed as the co-op's treasurer on several federal filings, had no driver's license, no social security number, and no voter registration in the state of Michigan. When a subpoena was delivered to the address associated with Wells, it turned out to be a storage unit in Grand Rapids rented under Dirk's name. Inside, boxes of unprocessed soil reports, fabricated invoices, and lease agreements between Dirk's various shell companies, all signed in his neat, looping cursive. Among the papers was a thumb drive containing a single Excel spreadsheet, the file name, Tulip Cycle/V3 Final. It was a roadmap of the entire scheme. Each parcel listed by number, followed by date of original acquisition, name of original landowner, shell company used, sale amount, subsidy grant collected, markup target, retain/flip decision. The total column at the bottom read $5,287,442. The festival facade. Perhaps the most cynical part of Dirk's scheme was how it weaponized the Tulip Festival itself. Each year, the city awarded contracts for festival services, temporary pavilions, walking tour, floral imports, parking lot rentals, etc. Most of these contracts were uncontested bids that went to companies in good standing. Dirk had created phantom vendors who submitted bids at inflated prices for festival infrastructure and won because they were the only bidders. These vendors never fulfilled the contracts, submitted phony invoices, and photoshopped images of in-progress work, cited weather delays and off-season timing for the lack of visible progress. City officials, overwhelmed by festival logistics and under pressure to keep tourists happy, approved payments anyway, assuming the work would be finished before next year's bloom. It never was. Investigators traced over $300,000 in festival-related payments directly into Dirk's accounts, funneled through one of his shell vendors, Heritage Tulip Services LLC, which, as it turned out, operated out of a shed behind his garage. The town had essentially paid him to scam it. The soft resistance. When news of the investigation quietly leaked in early 2005, something unexpected happened. Instead of outrage, there was hesitation. Farmers who had sold their land to Dirk at low prices refused to speak against him. One retired dairy owner simply said, "He paid us cash, no complaints." Town council members urged the planning commission to keep the review internal to avoid harming the festival's public image. Even Mayor Lynn Browning, who had publicly supported the expansion project from the start, dismissed the accusations. Dirk is a patriot. He's contributed more to this town than anyone in that commission office. Privately, however, things were tense. Browning had signed off on half a dozen of the fraudulent disbursements, trusting the paperwork because it came stamped with the festival committee's approval. And the festival committee, well, Dirk had once served as its treasurer. The arrest. It wasn't until the state attorney general's office became involved that real consequences arrived. By May 2005, with sufficient documentation, they filed charges against Dirk Van Os for wire fraud, forgery, money laundering, falsification of government grant applications, tax evasion. At the time of his arrest, Dirk was in his backyard tending to a small tulip bed. According to the arresting officer, he simply looked up and said, "Took you longer than I thought." He was 74 years old. The trial of the Bloom King. The case became a media fascination. The tulip fraudster, mailman of many LLCs, and Dirk the Dutchman were common headlines. In court, Dirk remained calm. He didn't deny his actions. His defense: "I didn't steal, I simply created opportunity. The town got its festival. The farmers got their payouts. And I got paid for my work." It was, in his view, a victimless crime. But prosecutors presented a different picture, a web of deliberate deceit, structured to look like civic pride, while bleeding public money through trust and illusion. Witnesses included Maribel Sanchez, who revealed the full scope of the grant laundering, soil scientists who confirmed the tulip land was unfit for planting, a contractor who testified that Dirk offered him $5,000 in cash to submit a fake invoice. In October 2006, Dirk Van Os was convicted on 11 counts of fraud and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, with an additional $1.8 million restitution order, most of which was never recovered. A town in reflection. After Dirk's sentencing, Harlem quietly dismantled the Tulip Development Co-op and paused all festival expansion plans. The 2007 festival was notably subdued. A few signs were missing. Some tents looked older, but the tulips still bloomed. Local papers debated whether Dirk had hurt or helped the town. One columnist called him a man who loved Harlem so much, he conned it into growth. The town council, embarrassed but eager to move on, created a transparency task force. Permitting processes were overhauled. Grant applications were required to go through independent auditing. Dirk's name was stripped from the festival's donor wall. But the impact lingered. For many, the betrayal wasn't about money, it was about the manipulation of identity. Dirk had used their shared heritage, tulips, trust, and quiet rural dignity as the tools of his scheme. And the worst part, it had almost worked. So in a town where flowers bloom for tourists but secrets bloom underground, how many other stories go unplanted? And in communities built on trust, who's minding the ledger when the thief knows everyone by name? Story 5. The Freezer Vault, a cold case inside a deli. It was just after 5 a.m. on a biting February morning in Bridgeport, Connecticut, when Anthony "Tony" DeLuca, the longtime owner of DeLuca's Italian Market, arrived to prep the day's sandwiches and cold cuts. The shop had been in his family since 1949. Red tiles on the floor, deli case full of aged provolone, and the smell of imported olives mixing with fresh bread, it was a landmark for locals. Tony, now in his 60s, had inherited the store from his father, Vito, and ran it with the kind of meticulous devotion passed down like a recipe. But on that morning in 2009, something was off. He walked into the back freezer to grab pancetta and found something frozen to the concrete. A shoe. Inside was a human foot, frozen solid and sticking out from beneath a pile of vacuum-sealed lamb shoulders. First freeze. Within hours, the deli was cordoned off with yellow tape. News helicopters hovered. Locals huddled behind barricades, coffee cups steaming in their hands, as officers from the Bridgeport Police Department carried out the freezer's contents, box by box. The discovery wasn't just a horror, it was a time capsule. The body was fully frozen, curled into a fetal position, dressed in slacks and a dress shirt and wrapped in butcher paper. The freezer was a sealed walk-in, originally used for dry aging meats, and hadn't been serviced in over a decade. Tony insisted he had no idea there was a body inside. And he might have been telling the truth. The rear freezer, known by staff as the Old Vault, hadn't been used for food storage since a compressor failed in 1998. It had become a glorified storage closet, old signage, shelves of expired dry goods, and backup kitchenware. No one had entered the far corner in years. Who was the frozen man? The body, after being thawed under controlled conditions at the state lab in New Haven, revealed several clues. White male, mid-50s, estimated time of death between 1995 and 1999. No wallet, no ID, no jewelry. A faint tattoo on the left forearm, FD 1968. 2 healed fractures in the ribs, consistent with past blunt force trauma. A single, small-caliber bullet lodged beneath the right clavicle. No immediate signs of struggle. The bullet suggested execution, not accident. When the autopsy was completed, the case became a homicide investigation, but without a name, without a motive, and without any initial connection to the DeLuca family. That changed when they pulled an inventory list from the freezer's original maintenance records. There, tucked in a 1997 repair receipt, was a signature. Frank DiMaggio. A missing man. Frank DiMaggio was a name some of the older detectives recognized. He'd been a mid-level enforcer for the Patriarca crime family, based out of Providence but known to frequent New Haven and Bridgeport during the mob's waning years. DiMaggio vanished in late 1997, shortly after the FBI launched Operation Sea Spray, a sting targeting mafia-run unions in the Connecticut, Rhode Island corridor. At the time, DiMaggio was believed to have flipped, feeding information about illegal waterfront rackets to federal agents. When he disappeared, no one was surprised rats didn't last long in that world. The FBI had quietly closed his file in 2002, citing presumed deceased, no body found. Until now. Tony's denial. When detectives informed Tony DeLuca that a known mob informant had been found in his freezer, he went pale. He insisted he'd never heard of Frank DiMaggio. He'd never employed anyone by that name, never knowingly had contact with the mob, and certainly never killed anyone. But detectives uncovered something curious. Vito DeLuca, Tony's father and the deli's original owner, had a criminal record dating back to the 1970s: illegal gambling, tax fraud, and suspected organized crime ties. Though never convicted, Vito had been questioned during multiple federal investigations into mob-controlled food distribution networks. At one point, he was listed as an unindicted co-conspirator in a case involving tainted meat contracts at portside vendors. The deli, it seemed, had been on the periphery of mob business for decades. Could Vito have known DiMaggio? Could the freezer have been used to store more than meat? The mob's cold silence. When the FBI was looped into the investigation, retired agents confirmed that Frank DiMaggio had been scheduled to testify against multiple figures involved in port union corruption. His handler had lost contact with him just days before his appearance at a grand jury hearing. Records showed that DiMaggio's last known location was Bridgeport. One theory emerged. DiMaggio had been lured to the deli for a meeting, possibly by someone he trusted, then executed and hidden in the walk-in freezer, the perfect place to buy time and obscure the crime. But who had access? Tony had only just taken over full operations in 1999. Vito DeLuca, though aged, was still active in the deli in 1997. And Vito had died in 2004. No confession, no connection ever proven. An unlikely witness. In 2010, while reviewing unrelated security footage from a nearby pawn shop, part of a cold case task force cross-reference project, investigators noticed a curious scene dated October 28, 1997. The camera, mounted across the street, captured a grainy view of the alley behind DeLuca's deli. At 11:42 p.m., a figure is seen unlocking the deli's side door. Moments later, a second man arrives. He carries something, possibly a bag or satchel. They disappear inside. 34 minutes later, only one man exits. FBI agents believe the first man was Vito DeLuca. They were never able to identify the second figure. The timestamp aligns with DiMaggio's last known phone ping. But without higher resolution footage, the case remained circumstantial. If Frank DiMaggio's body had been hidden in plain sight for over a decade, what else had been quietly stored or erased from the deli's past? And if the crime was tied to a dead man, would the truth ever truly thaw? The frozen corpse of Frank DiMaggio might have finally resurfaced in 2009. But the real mystery wasn't his death, it was how nobody noticed for 12 years. The walk-in freezer where his body was found had been part of DeLuca's deli since the early 1980s, a repurposed meat locker from when the family briefly operated as a neighborhood butcher. It was a cold, tiled vault tucked at the end of a hallway, technically still functional, but largely unused after a compressor failure in 1998. After that, it became a junk closet. Or so people thought. But investigators now believed that freezer had become something else entirely, a perfect hiding place, shielded by routine and dust. The more they examined the layout of the building, the more they realized no one would have found that body unless they were specifically looking. And nobody had been. A file reopened. In 2011, the Bridgeport Cold Case Unit, in partnership with the FBI, formally reopened the DiMaggio case as an unsolved mafia-related homicide. While the body had finally been recovered, the trail was more frostbitten than fresh. They started with what little remained from the original DiMaggio case file. Last seen, October 28, 1997. Last call to his FBI handler, stating the meeting set. Location ping, a burner phone tracing to downtown Bridgeport. Alias used, Frank Dassault. Clothing at time of disappearance, gray dress shirt, slacks, steel-toed boots matched the body. The working theory was that DiMaggio had been planning to flip on union racketeers, likely violating a code of silence he had once enforced himself. He'd burned bridges. The call to his handler suggested confidence. But he never showed up for the meeting. He went off-grid and into the ice. Tony's tightrope. At the heart of the investigation was Tony DeLuca, the reluctant heir to his father's legacy. Tony maintained he had no knowledge of DiMaggio's presence in the freezer, and he had passed multiple polygraph tests. He cooperated with investigators, handed over decades worth of old receipts, vendor lists, payroll records, and even consented to a full forensic sweep of the deli. Nothing incriminating surfaced except a series of old appointment calendars from 1997, handwritten in neat block letters. One entry, dated October 28, simply read, Pop After Hours MTG FD 1000P. The initials FD raised red flags. When questioned, Tony admitted the calendar had belonged to his father Vito and said he never noticed the note before. But to the FBI, this was the closest thing to a confession they'd get. Vito's shadows. While Vito DeLuca had died in 2004, his long-standing reputation as a man with old connections wasn't just neighborhood lore. He had a long but largely toothless rap sheet. 1969, bookmaking charges dropped. 1975, questioned in a meat supply fraud ring. 1983, named in a RICO investigation but never charged. 1991, cited during a federal probe into Teamsters union bribes. He'd spent his life skirting charges, often ducking behind a well-worn apron and the plausible deniability of just being a deli guy. But Vito's connection to the Patriarca family wasn't speculation. A retired federal agent, interviewed anonymously in a 2011 report, confirmed. Vito was small-time, but he was trusted. He wasn't the muscle. He was the cooler. He held the heat, held the secrets. If you needed someone disappeared for a few days, he had the keys to the cold. Was Frank DiMaggio's death a favor, a punishment, a silence-for-hire arrangement, or was it simply mob politics, the cost of betrayal? There were no answers, only echoes. A whisper from the past. In 2012, detectives re-interviewed Vinny Ice Di Leo, a former Patriarca associate turned informant now living in federal protection. When asked about DiMaggio's disappearance, Vinny gave a now-famous response. Frankie, hell, I thought he was in Boca. Guess he took a colder retirement. Pressed further, Vinny admitted that DiMaggio had been talking too much in '97 and that somebody local had been tapped to handle it quiet. Not a shooter, a freezer. Old guy, deli man. Hell of a veal parm. The inference was clear Vito De Luca had been tasked with holding DiMaggio until a cleaner could take care of the rest. But either the job was done on site, or the freezer became both the holding cell and the grave. A legal freeze. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, no charges were filed against Tony or any surviving De Luca family members. Vito was long dead, and no living witnesses could definitively place Frank DiMaggio at the deli before his disappearance. The case was ultimately labeled cold homicide suspected organized crime, unresolved. Tony, though cleared, found himself a pariah in the very community that once revered his family. Customers dwindled. The deli's reputation soured like old meat. By 2014, De Luca's Italian market closed its doors for good. The building was sold. The new owners gutted the walk-in freezer and converted the back room into a wine cellar. The freezer, once a tomb, became a tour stop for culinary students, though few knew what had once been stored behind those metal doors. But if the freezer held a body that no one claimed, and a murder no one confessed to, how many other crimes sit frozen in places no one dares to look? And when silence is inherited like a recipe, what gets passed down besides the sausage? Story 6. The Monk Who Took the Crown of Brie. Atop a mossy hillside in the Bourgogne-Franche-Comté region of eastern France stands the Abbé Saint-Croix de Bois, a Benedictine monastery whose golden limestone walls have endured centuries of revolution, occupation, and silence. The monks who reside there live by the rule of Saint Benedict obedience, humility, manual labor, and the production of their most sacred commodity. Fromage de la Couronne, the crown of Brie. Creamy, fragrant, and aged in limestone caves beneath the abbey, it was a cheese known not just for its taste, but its rarity. Only a few hundred wheels were produced each year, and each one bore the insignia of the abbey, a crown-embossed seal made from carved olive wood. By tradition, the cheese was sold only to select distributors, luxury grocers in Paris, Rome, and a handful of Michelin-starred chefs. The rest was gifted, bartered, or consumed in reverent silence within the monastery's stone halls. So when an extra 3,000 wheels of Couronne, Brie, began appearing on luxury markets in 2017, no one was more shocked than the monks themselves. What followed would be called Le vol sacré, the sacred theft, and it would expose one of the most peculiar white-collar crimes in modern culinary history, perpetrated not by an outsider, but by a monk among their own ranks. Brother Alaric. Born Jacques-Antoine Delorme in Marseille, Brother Alaric was a quiet, studious man in his early 40s when he took vows and joined the abbey in 2006. He had worked in software logistics before his calling, highly educated, disciplined, and fluent in 6 languages. His arrival was welcomed by the aging abbots. Alaric brought order to the cloister's ancient record-keeping, reorganized centuries of handwritten ledgers into a clean, digital archive, and helped secure new funding from regional heritage grants. When the abbey began offering a rare online ordering portal for their cheese in 2012, it was Alaric's system that made it possible. He was not a cheesemaker. He didn't age the rounds or test the rinds, but he controlled the paperwork, the shipping, the invoices, the tracking numbers, the aging logs, the cave inventories. He alone knew exactly how many wheels were made, how many sold, and how many could disappear without notice. First signs of decay. In early 2017, a cheese affiner in Lyon contacted the abbey with an odd inquiry. A supplier had offered him Couronne-branded Brie at a 40% discount, claiming to be a preferred monk intermediary. The batch was perfect, visually indistinguishable from authentic product, vacuum-sealed, crowned with the abbey's signature burnished label. but the monks had no record of it. Wheels that had supposedly left the abbey never did. More inquiries followed. A hotel in Dubai claimed to receive 80 wheels in a private shipment. A Tokyo retailer posted Instagram photos of exclusive Saint Croix wheels. A wealthy French restaurateur claimed to have bought 200 rounds directly from a brother Jean-Louis. No such monk existed. The abbey began an internal review. What they uncovered was a yawning discrepancy between their production numbers and external appearances of their cheese. An estimated 2,950 wheels had been sold under the abbey's name, with fake invoices and altered batch numbers, but never made in the abbey caves. A sacred scheme. Suspicion turned toward the logistics system. At the center was Brother Alaric, who maintained the only full-access credentials to the abbey's digital aging logs, outbound shipping records, and digital stamp press, used to generate the QR codes embossed on the packaging. When questioned, Alaric claimed that the discrepancy must have come from unauthorized cloning of their packaging and logos by counterfeiters. But there was a problem. The wheels matched internal serials numbers never released to the public. Only someone with full access could have generated them. Worse still, security footage from a restricted storage area installed for insurance compliance, not monastery policy, revealed Alaric entering the cave's storage after Compline, alone, removing 2 boxes and returning empty-handed. The boxes were never logged. They confronted him. He denied everything. 2 days later, Brother Alaric vanished. The Marseille connection. The abbey, scandalized but desperate to maintain dignity, initially avoided law enforcement. But the theft wasn't small. By conservative estimates, the market value of the missing cheese exceeded 1.5 million euros, especially in black market culinary circles, where provenance is often more valuable than taste. Interpol was quietly contacted, and the search for Jacques-Antoine Delorme began. The investigation led back to Marseille, Alaric's hometown. There, agents uncovered a storage facility rented under the name J. Antoine, stocked with brie wheels in pristine condition, some aged, some still maturing, all bearing the abbey's branding. A small office within the storage unit revealed a counterfeit labeling machine, a heat stamp press identical to the abbey, forged customs documentation for shipments to Dubai, Tokyo, and New York, a digital inventory management system mirroring the abbey's logs down to the fonts and phrasing. Delorme, it seemed, had created a duplicate supply chain, built in the shadows of the real one, leveraging his knowledge of timing, inventory, and the abbey's reluctance to scrutinize its own. But why would a monk, having sworn a vow of simplicity and obedience, go to such lengths to mimic the very sacred system he was meant to protect? And how many of the elite wheels on Michelin menus were truly divine versus criminal in rind? The duplicate operation discovered in Marseille confirmed the growing fear within the cloistered walls of Abbé Saint-Croix de Bois. Brother Alaric, once the abbey's most gifted logistical mind, had not only betrayed his vows, but had built a counterfeit dairy empire, trafficking sacred cheese through a criminal supply chain of indulgence. Yet despite the evidence, Alaric himself was gone. No arrest, no signed confession, no trace. And the mystery, like the cheese, only ripened. A mirror supply chain. Interpol analysts described what they found in Marseille as shockingly sophisticated. The facility was fitted with custom refrigeration units, replicating the humidity and aging conditions of the abbey's own limestone caves. There were 6 distinct aging rooms, each labeled in Latin with monastic names: Sanctum, Tempus, Inidium, and so on, suggesting Alaric had retained not just his training, but his reverence for the system he betrayed. More disturbing was the counterfeit branding process. A high-resolution laser printer recreated the abbey's crown insignia. A stamp press carved by hand matched the abbey's wood-seared crown seal. Dozens of blank parchment certificates of provenance, signed Fr. Jean-Louis Archivarius, a fictional role within the abbey, were ready for export. Shipping labels showed regular deliveries to addresses in Dubai, Singapore, Osaka, and even Monaco. Interpol now believed Alaric had created an underground brand that only appeared exclusive, one that didn't just mimic the abbey, but marketed itself as more authentic than the original. Some recipients of the counterfeit wheels were high-end chefs and collectors, convinced they were buying rare product direct from monks, off record. They weren't complicit, they were duped by luxury contraband. A quiet revelation. Back at St. Croix, a fuller picture of the deception came into focus. When Brother Matthew, the current cellarer in charge of provisions, began cross-referencing physical stock against the abbey's digital logs, he found that Alaric had padded production reports for 5 years. Example: log 412 wheels entered aging caves, 2016. Actual physical count, 318. The missing 94 wheels were never noticed. Because inventory surplus was never questioned, the monks simply attributed it to spoilage, donation, or quiet redistribution. In truth, Alaric had been diverting hundreds of wheels a year, creating just enough false reporting to mask the theft, never too much to trigger alarm. In total, over 2,700 wheels were confirmed as stolen between 2012 and 2017. With black market prices reaching upwards of €500 per wheel, the fraud was now estimated at €1.35 million in product. A crisis of faith. The monks struggled with what to do next. To call the police again would mean exposing more internal records. To remain silent would allow their name to be attached to tainted cheese. So they issued a public statement, unprecedented in tone. We have been betrayed by one of our own. Forgiveness is our duty, but transparency is our responsibility. Not all cheese bearing our mark was born in our caves. Those who bought it in good faith, we ask for yours now in return. The cheese world responded in shock. A handful of chefs in Tokyo and Dubai voluntarily destroyed their remaining wheels. Others, less noble, simply marked prices higher. Contraband brie became a phrase whispered in food forums, and sightings of Brother Alaric began popping up online. A man in a cassock boarding a flight in Zurich. A cheesemonger in Palermo claiming a new supplier with holy roots. A cafe in Bruges with monk cheese, and no listed distributor. Each lead evaporated. Interpol issued a red notice under the name Jacques-Antoine Delorme, but no arrest ever followed. A stolen crown. In late 2019, a Belgian food blogger investigating underground cheese markets in Antwerp was approached by a man using the alias Brother Lucien. He offered a single wheel of fromage de la Couronne, wax-sealed, with a forged 2018 provenance certificate. The man said quietly, "There are 2 crowns now, one was blessed, one was earned." Then he vanished. Fingerprints lifted from the box matched Delorme. It was the last confirmed sighting. Justice of a kind. Unable to bring Alaric to trial, the abbey turned inward. They halted public sales for 2 years, destroyed all aging wheels produced during the years of Alaric's tenure, and rewrote their rule of distribution. They returned to a strict barter model, only selling to those who visited in person, through a new pilgrimage cheese initiative. The new label no longer bore the original olive-wood stamp. Instead, it showed an open palm with a broken crown resting in it. The message was clear: we lost something and we accept it. But if a man could duplicate holiness through logistics and manufacture reverence through packaging, was it truly the cheese people were buying or the story that came with it? Story 7. Vinyl for Blood, the record store that disappeared. In the heart of downtown San Luis Obispo, California, tucked between an antique camera shop and a vegan bakery, once sat a narrow, unassuming storefront called Needle and Wax. The windows were papered with gig posters from the 70s, the kind of sun-bleached flyers that curled at the edges and advertised bands no one remembered. Inside, the air was always a little stale, with the scent of old cardboard sleeves and aged leather jackets. To passing tourists, it looked like any other retro vinyl shop, maybe even a little too curated in its nostalgia. But to the locals, especially those who'd grown up in the area, Needle and Wax was a place that never changed. And that was part of the problem. Because the store, its owner, and its secret history were all tied to a series of unsolved disappearances that spanned over 4 decades. And in 2020, just as the pandemic shuttered most small shops, Needle and Wax vanished overnight, not just closed down, but erased, as if it had never existed at all. A store without time. The earliest mention of Needle and Wax appears in a 1977 business license issued to a Vincent H. Lorado, listed as sole proprietor of a vinyl and cassette outlet. The photo on the license shows a man in his early 40s with slick-back black hair, horn-rimmed glasses, and a severe expression. No smile, just a blank stare into the DMV lens. The store was never listed in the yellow pages. Yet it was always there. Locals remembered it being open when they were teenagers and still open when they brought their kids decades later. The window displays changed just enough to seem updated, but the records on the shelves, mostly the same. More unsettling was the man behind the counter. "He looked the same every time I went in," said Marcus Teague, a DJ who frequented the store from 1984 to 2019. "Never smiled, never aged, always wore the same wool blazer. The weird part, he remembered your name even if you hadn't been in for 10 years. The man was always introduced as Mr. Lorado. There were no employees, no sign of a register. All transactions were cash only, and every receipt was handwritten. When questioned later, customers recalled the lighting as dim, the aisles too narrow, and the atmosphere a little too quiet for a shop with turntables. Some said they could hear music playing in the back room, songs that didn't seem to exist anywhere else." The missing 4. Between 1981 and 2006, 4 young men disappeared in or around the downtown SLO area. Their cases were never connected publicly, but a journalist named Lee Corbin, working on a cold case podcast in 2019, noticed something strange in the police files. All 4 had visited Needle and Wax within 72 hours of vanishing. She began pulling at the thread. Evan Glaser, 17, last seen entering the store in 1981. Miguel Cortez, 22, frequented the store weekly, disappeared in 1990. James J.J. Harper, 18, last debit card use. Adjacent coffee shop, 1998. Darren Ye, 20, missing since 2006. Friends said he was obsessed with the place. In all 4 cases, there were no witnesses placing the victims outside the downtown core after their last known interaction with the shop. No phone pings, no confirmed sightings, no exit. Corbin began interviewing locals who remembered Needle and Wax. Several spoke of a strange back room, supposedly off-limits to customers. One older regular, a former record collector named Glenn Madsen, described once seeing a locked door behind the jazz section, just barely ajar. He heard faint music coming from it, but it was in reverse, like the record was spinning backwards. "It didn't sound right," he told Corbin. "It wasn't just reversed, it was off, like voices layered in the melody. I left and never went back." Corbin brought her findings to the San Luis Obispo Police Department. Her contact there was sympathetic but skeptical. Without a crime scene, and with a store that technically still operated legally, there was little they could do. So she waited. A pandemic disappearance. In April 2020, California issued lockdown orders due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Corbin decided to do a drive-by check on needle and wax during quarantine. She found the door padlocked from the outside, the windows papered over entirely not with posters but with brown butcher paper. A small, handwritten sign read, "Closed for inventory, we'll be back." She took photos, waited a few weeks, came back. The store was gone. Not just shuttered, gutted. The signage had been removed. The door had been replaced with a modern glass front. Inside was an empty commercial space with fresh drywall and exposed conduit. Corbin checked property records. There had been no sale. The last known leaseholder was still listed as Vincent H. Lorado, but the contact information was disconnected. Even more bizarre, the business license had been retroactively deactivated in 1998. City records had no explanation for how the shop continued operating for 2 decades after that. She attempted to contact other former customers. Many said they'd stopped noticing the shop years ago. Some said they assumed it had closed in the 90s. Only a handful remembered it at all. A record unearthed. Corbin's investigation culminated in one final twist. While searching estate sale listings in 2021, she discovered a lot of rare vinyls from a defunct SLO estate. Among the stacks was a plain, unmarked 10-inch record with no sleeve, no label. On it, handwritten in faded marker, "Property of V.H. Lorado." She purchased it and had it cleaned by a local audio specialist. The grooves, warped from age, played a single 3-minute track. It was instrumental, eerie, low-frequency hums layered with static, then a brief voice. Listen closely, you already know how this ends. A reverse spin revealed the same voice saying, "We never leave, we just stop playing." Story 7. Vinyl for Blood, the record store that disappeared. In the summer of 2021, Lee Corbin, by now a rising figure in the true crime podcast world, was in possession of a record that had no clear origin and a signature that belonged to a man who, on paper, shouldn't have existed for the last 20 years. But when she played the record for the 3rd time, this time on an analog tube amp system, at a collector's request, something changed. The hum was still there, the reversed voice too. But underneath it, layered so faintly it required frequency isolation to hear, was another voice. And this one was crying for help. Hidden frequencies. Corbin had the track analyzed by Dr. Jeanette Ng, a retired forensic audio specialist from UC Berkeley, who had worked on cold cases involving wiretaps and missing persons. After running spectral analysis, she found something deeply unsettling. "There are multiple voice layers encoded here," Ng said. "One of them is pleading." She isolated the low-frequency band and cleaned it digitally. The result was a cracked male voice saying, "Can anyone hear me? I'm still here. I didn't want to go in." Ng and Corbin compared the vocal profile with publicly available family videos of Darren Yeh, the most recent missing man associated with needle and wax. It was a near match, 86% vocal fingerprint accuracy, which raised the unthinkable question: how does the voice of a missing person end up on an unmarked vinyl record found in an estate sale, tied to a business that legally didn't exist? The Estate of Echoes. The estate in question belonged to a recluse named Bernard Hallstrom, a known vinyl hoarder and former studio engineer who had lived off the grid in Paso Robles, about 30 minutes north of San Luis Obispo. Hallstrom had passed from natural causes in 2020, and his remaining possessions, hundreds of records, amps, and rare audio equipment, were sold in a liquidation sale. Corbin traced the name through archival employment records and found that Hallstrom had once worked as a sound engineer for Needle and Wax in the early 1980s, a job never previously documented. Even stranger, his employment overlapped with the disappearance of Evan Glaser, the very first young man to vanish after a known visit to the store. Hidden in Hallstrom's storage unit, discovered after a second round of estate inventory, were 4 reel-to-reel tapes marked Voice Study, N&W Sessions, a file folder containing receipts and cash invoices labeled NWAX Private Pressings, a single-page document titled Sound Imprint Theory, Transfer of Emotional Resonance via Analog Capture. In it, Hallstrom described a belief that intense psychological states could imprint on analog audio tape and be remanifested through playback. It was pseudoscience or madness, but it was oddly consistent with what the voices on the mystery record seemed to suggest. Surveillance, shadows, and silence. Corbin's revelations began gaining traction among internet sleuths and analog audio communities. Forums began buzzing about the San Luis Obispo shop that erased you and the crying record. As pressure mounted, Corbin requested official statements from the SLOPD, California Department of Justice, and even the FBI. All declined to comment. Then, one night in October 2021, she noticed her hard drive light blinking. Her external backup, one never connected to the internet, was showing signs of remote access. Files related to Needle and Wax were missing or corrupted. The only files that remained were blank notepad documents with file names like Can't Leave TXT, All Groove No Exit TXT, Side B Never Stops TXT. Corbin posted about the intrusion on her podcast's Reddit board. Within 48 hours, her post was flagged and removed by mods for violating rules about harmful speculation. The next week, her podcast went dark. Episodes about Needle and Wax were deleted across platforms. Her official explanation: pending legal issues. Unofficially, sources close to her said she received a cease and desist from an unknown law firm representing a defunct commercial entity. The signature was marked VH and Associates. The store returns. In late 2022, a photographer from Sacramento visited San Luis Obispo for a wedding. Walking downtown, he snapped a street shot of the row of shops, nothing unusual. But when he reviewed the photo weeks later, he noticed a strange storefront. No visible signage, no address. Just a dim window, behind which sat a stack of vinyl records. One record had a label that read, "Still Playing." He went back a month later. The storefront was gone, replaced by a frozen yogurt chain. He swore the records had been there. Is it possible that a storefront could act as a trapdoor for memory, for time, for people themselves? Can a man's obsession with analog fidelity become a kind of prison, one recorded not on tape, but in the silence between grooves? Or is Needle and Wax just an echo chamber of paranoia, grief, and unsolved loss? Story 8. The Glass Jar Confessions, Cold Cream and Colder Crimes. In 1994, on the outskirts of Dubuque, Iowa, the death of Eleanor Me Dobbins, an 83-year-old retired beautician, was officially ruled as natural causes. She died in her sleep, alone in a faded Victorian house with lace curtains, a velvet fainting couch, and rows of glass jars neatly aligned along every wall. The coroner listed the cause of death as heart failure. There were no signs of trauma. No toxicology tests were performed. It wasn't until 2 decades later, when a local real estate agent purchased the property from a distant relative and began renovations, that what was inside those jars would be examined. And what they found would reopen 6 missing persons cases in 3 states and bring national attention to what would become known as the Glass Jar Confessions. The house on Walnut Street. The house at 412 Walnut Street was an elegant, if slightly crumbling, remnant of another time. Eleanor had lived there since 1953. Neighbors recalled her as quiet, proper, always smelling faintly of lilac. Her routine never changed. Early morning walks, afternoon phone calls to her sister in Minnesota, and evenings spent in her converted parlor where she once operated a home beauty salon. From the 1960s through the early 80s, she catered to elderly women, mostly widows and housewives in the neighborhood, offering perms, cold creams, and gossip in equal measure. She stopped taking clients after her husband died in 1982. But the parlor remained intact, untouched and unnervingly pristine, until it was rediscovered in 2015. That's when real estate agent Clara Yoon entered the home after closing the sale. What she found was a kind of shrine-lace doilies, antique salon chairs, and over 200 small glass jars labeled in careful cursive, each sealed with wax and dated, most between 1967 and 1985. Inside, unknown cosmetic mixtures, powders, creams, and something that looked like organic matter. At first, Clara thought they were just samples, strange, old, maybe moldy. But one jar, dated 1971, had a sliver of what appeared to be fingernail embedded in the cream. She contacted the police. An investigation begins. The initial response from Dubuque PD was restrained. Officers assumed it was simply expired product, perhaps a morbid but harmless collection. But when the first jar was tested, traces of human blood were detected. Further testing revealed Jar 14, 1974, contained preserved human skin tissue, dermal layer intact. Jar 52, 1981, cream laced with a high concentration of diazepam. Jar 77, 1978, embedded with a human molar, stained and cracked. Jar 101, 1969, base material included ashes confirmed to be of human origin. The Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation, DCI, took over. Using a mix of mitochondrial DNA testing, historic missing persons databases, and dental records, they linked 5 jars to known missing persons from Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin, all women, all last seen between 1966 and 1983, all ages 50 to 70 at the time of disappearance. Each had visited or been associated with a Leaner Dobbins home salon. The beautician's log. Among the papers in Aleener's roll-top desk, DCI found a set of handwritten appointment books, some dating back to 1961. They were fastidious, color-coded by client and treatment type. Blue ink, cold cream facials. Red ink, special blend perm kits. Green ink, repeat clients. But a peculiar symbol appeared next to 11 names, a small drawn jar beside the booking entry. Each of those clients disappeared within a year of the appointment. The handwriting was unmistakably Aleener's. DCI forensic psychologist Dr. Leon Farber posited that the jars weren't just cosmetic curiosities, they were ritual trophies, keepsakes of crimes committed in ritualized fashion. It's as if she believed she was preserving their essence through beauty, skin, cream, bone. The medium was her obsession. The message was control. A pattern emerges. Of the 6 identified victims, each shared the following traits. Lived alone. Attended Aleener's salon at least once. Had no immediate family within the county. Disappeared within 6-12 months of final appointment. Police began calling the case the beautician's harvest. With no surviving witnesses and Aleener long deceased, the DCI struggled to determine exact methods. However, based on compound analysis, investigators theorized that Aleener used topical sedatives to immobilize her victims during facials, oral tranquilizers mixed into tea served during appointments, asphyxiation as a likely method of death, though no bodies were found. Many of the missing women were previously considered voluntary disappearances due to their advanced age and solitary lifestyles. The prevailing assumption had been that they moved, died anonymously, or were victims of unrelated crimes. Instead, the quiet woman with a jar of lilac cream may have made them disappear without a trace. Why did Aline or Dobbins preserve their remains so carefully, so delicately, inside jars intended for beauty products? Was this a twisted form of artistry or something even darker? And did anyone else suspect her during those long years when women quietly vanished, one after another? The State Forensic Lab in Des Moines was overwhelmed. Of the 212 jars recovered from Aline Dobbins' home, 63 contained organic material, either biological tissue, dental remnants, blood, or ash. But fewer than a dozen could be directly linked to known missing persons, leaving investigators with a chilling truth. They would never know how many women she'd taken. And yet, despite the growing horror, there was no crime scene, no confession, and no clear cause of death for any victim. So the DCI pivoted. They decided to build a psychological profile of Aline, in hopes of understanding what kind of woman would kill quietly, methodically, and with so much care. The quiet girl from Anamosa. Born in 1911, Aline Mee Dobbins grew up in Anamosa, Iowa, the youngest of 6 siblings in a conservative, church-going family. Her father ran a hardware store. Her mother, according to local historians, was a cold woman with strict rules about appearance and behavior. School records showed Aline excelled in chemistry and home economics. She graduated from a local beauty academy in 1930, then worked at a department store salon until marrying Howard Dobbins, a milk delivery driver, in 1948. They bought the house on Walnut Street in 1953, and shortly after, she opened her home-based salon in the front parlor. By all accounts, Aline was polite but aloof, elegant, always in pressed dresses and red lipstick. Deeply private, she had no close friends, no known social circle. When Howard died of a stroke in 1982, neighbors assumed Aline would sell the house or move in with family. She did neither. Instead, she grew more reclusive, but never stopped opening her doors to select clients. The parlor remained spotless. The chair cushions were replaced every few years. She even kept a guest book, though names were often written in the same handwriting as if she'd filled it in herself. The Milwaukee case. In 2016, while the DCI was still sifting through the evidence, a cold case detective from Milwaukee named Ed Ramirez contacted them. He had heard about the Dobbins case through professional channels and wanted to cross-reference one of his cases: the 1975 disappearance of Gloria Fisher, a 63-year-old retired secretary who vanished after visiting friends in Dubuque. Gloria was thought to have wandered off, possibly suffering early dementia. Her last known contact was an appointment with a home beautician recommended by a neighbor. There was no follow-up. Ramirez provided a copy of Gloria's dental records and a black and white photo from 1973. Weeks later, Iowa DCI confirmed. Tooth from jar 31 matched Gloria Fisher. Hair samples embedded in an oily cream base were also a match. The handwriting in Aline's logbook from July 2, 1975, listed GF green rinse plus brow wax with the jar symbol next to it. This was the 6th victim positively identified. And it confirmed a disturbing pattern. Aline had cross-state clientele, often through word of mouth or ladies who knew ladies. She didn't need to lure, they came willingly. An unpublished manuscript. During a second sweep of the house, an old makeup case was found hidden in a crawlspace beneath the floorboards. Inside, 5 tubes of expired lipstick, a rusted pair of shears, and a composition notebook with no title on the cover. The contents were chilling. Written in neat cursive, it was a blend of diary entries and strange instructions. Some excerpts included: "The skin remembers what the soul cannot. Always cold cream first, they relax with the scent. A woman's last breath smells like powder, Hold it in your nose and don't exhale. Don't keep everything, a piece will do, a whisper under wax. It wasn't a confession, but it was as close as anyone would get. Forensic linguists compared the writing to Aliner's known hand and concluded it was 99% likely authored by her. The notebook became known in internal files as the Ritual Codex, and it painted Aliner not as a frenzied killer, but as a woman with a method, a belief system, and possibly a dissociative worldview that allowed her to equate killing with preservation. The daughter who never was. In late 2016, a curious name surfaced. Marissa Dobbins, age 61, listed as the beneficiary of Aliner's modest savings account and the person who had paid the property taxes from 2008-2013. Investigators found her living in Davenport, Iowa, under the name Marissa Hill. She was, in fact, Aliner's niece, orphaned at age 9 and briefly raised by Aliner before being sent to a boarding school in Des Moines. Marissa remembered very little, just that Aliner had been kind but rigid. She had rules, quiet hours, rituals, creams and powders and tea that always tasted a little metallic. I thought she was just elegant. Now I wonder if I was a test run. Marissa had not seen Aliner since 1985. She refused to take possession of the house. She gave the inheritance to a local domestic abuse shelter. And then she vanished from public life.